forget. Morning, everyone, or afternoon, or evening, depending on wherever you are in the world. It is October 9th, 2017, and this is SIG-Apps. If you are not speaking, please mute your mic. We have a few announcements today, followed by a demo and a discussion topic. The demo will be on Kubernetes monitoring by Netsil. The discussion topic will be on app definition convention proposal. Ben Perry's will lead that from Red Hat. And there was a retrospective scheduled for today. We'll go ahead and skip that session for now and move it up a week, move it by a week, since we want to make sure we have enough time for that as well. Okay, and I'm Michelle Nerley. I'm going to lead today. So announcements, we still have one flaky test. A job should run a job to completion when tasks sometimes fail and are not locally restarted. So that's outstanding. If you want to take a look at that, if you're working on that, that'd be great. Jamie has a status on operator kit. As I'll remember, there was a discussion topic on operator kit. So Jamie, go ahead and take it away with your announcement.
Sure. So, hey everyone, I just wanted to give a very quick sort of state of the union update about the current position of operators and operator kit. So a few months ago, I submitted a proposal to SIG-Apps, sort of outlining a new community project where we would write sort of a common library for people to sort of to help people write their own sort of operators and controllers and stuff like that, because one thing which we were seeing very often is that people are duplicating a lot of logic. There's no sort of established community standards for these kinds of things. So so I wrote a proposal. It seemed very well received. And the plan was to sort of immediately propose it for incubation. And so we had a few discussions in the community, and we realized that it wasn't probably the best thing to do. The best thing to do was to sort of come up with a proof of concept. Rook has an operator kit right now. As I say, a proof of concept. Sorry.
You were breaking up for me. Was anybody else experiencing Jamie breaking up? I just want to make sure everybody heard your announcement.
I heard.
Oh, no.
Clearly.
All right, that was just me then. I will.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I've been working with a few Rook people, and the plan is to sort of add more functionality as time goes on, and hopefully we can integrate it with other vendor projects. So I opened an issue with a Heptio project today, so Arc, which is their backup, disaster recovery backup mechanism. They use CRDs too. So I'm trying to sort of sync with other community members and trying to establish what their expectations are for any common library. So that's the current status. If anybody would like to help out, that would be awesome. I'm going to post the link to the initial proposal in the meeting notes for people to get more context. And if you'd like to help out and get involved in sort of controllers and operators, feel free to ping me on Slack and we can go from there. But yeah, that's about it.
Thanks so much. Does anybody have any quick questions for Jamie? All right, silence means no. Let's go ahead and go into the demos. Netsil, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is Sahil from Netsil, and I have my colleague Arvind on the call with me. Arvind is our VP of product, and he'll be doing the demo.
Hey guys, thanks for giving us the slot to present Netsil. Real quick, the problem that we are trying to solve is, hold on, let me hide this, is essentially that if you're running microservices, there are a lot of service interactions. Practically there isn't any good mechanism right now to visualize these service interactions, right? Short of like adding tracing code, there is no good alternative in the market. And if you're not able to understand these service interactions, which essentially make up like 70-80% of the logic inside microservices, right? And if you're not measuring the latency, errors, and throughput, you're kind of missing on key signals for the impending problems, right? If you're going to keep monitoring the CPU and memory and RAM, that's not sufficient in this world where a lot of interaction resides on the wire in the form of HTTP, DNS, MySQL, and things like that, right? So what Netsil has done, and you guys are very familiar with the cost of not doing this, not understanding these dependencies, outages and incident response is long. Whenever you do a code change, there are side effects and they're not very well evaluated and things like that. So what we are doing is, rather than relying solely on developers adding tracing code, what we're saying is, can you take the TCP IP packets, the L3 packets, and reconstruct the L7 protocol from there? So if you get a complete session of TCP IP, all the packets from that session, since every protocol is a finite state machine and a very deterministic one, you can actually take these packets and reconstruct whether it's an HTTP, DNS, MySQL, like all sorts of L7 insights, right? So that's what Netsil does. We take the raw packets from the host networking. So let's say our agents are deployed as a daemon set in Kubernetes, right? So they are operating on the host networking space. So they will capture all the packets from all the pods, right? And we will essentially reconstruct what this communication is going on. So this is not just like a TCP IP map that the network flow people used to have. This is more like an application map where you know that A and B are talking. A is this pod, A has this kube app labels, or it's in this namespace, and they're talking HTTP along with all the header information and DNS and MySQL queries and things like that. Make sense? And since we are doing the packet analysis, we get the latency, throughput, error rates for essentially for free, because that's information is there in pretty much all the handshake and communication that goes on in the wire. So real quick, I'm just going to show a quick small demo just to drive the point home of how the product looks. And all we have done in this environment, this is a Kubernetes cluster running in Google Cloud. Our collectors are pretty lightweight collectors. They are installed as daemon sets on the host. So one per host. It's not like it does not require agents per container or no sidecar. It's just one daemon set pod operating on the host networking space per host, right? And immediately after you install it, you can start getting a complete visibility into all the service interactions that as I had promised, right? So here I'm showing a pod level map. So each of these nodes are the pods in this environment, and I've filtered it by all the pod names here, right? So they're just two simple knobs, group by and filter, and you can move around in the map. Right, so I'm gonna make this a little bit more digestible because there are like a lot of pods, and this is even just a demo environment. Still, there are a lot of pods and interactions. So I can actually go ahead and zoom in on a particular namespace and start understanding what's going on, what's the dependency structure. By the way, I can do this live. So this is from 1 hour ago or 10 minutes ago to now. But I can also do this historical. Like I can go back in time and understand the interactions at any previous time point, right? So now you can see that this is how the sock shop looks, right? This is the interactions. And you might have seen this kind of maps in SysDig or Weavescope. Now, one difference is in the level of details that we are extracting from the reconstruction of the protocol, right? So in Weavescope or SysDig, you're not going to be able to find the HTTP reconstruction. Those things are difficult to reconstruct the protocol. So that's our sort of secret sauce here. And you can see the latency, throughput, error rates by the URI, by actual 400, 500 counts and things like that, right? I know that was a pretty quick, short demo, but we have full monitoring and capabilities along with all the dashboards, alerts, querying, flexibility, and things like that. So it's a complete monitoring solution. Along with you can understand anytime you can understand the service interactions that are going on at the pod level or at the namespace or at the container levels. I'm going to stop here because I've been talking nonstop for 10 minutes. So let me pause and see if that's a good overview.
Yeah, thanks for that. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, I have a quick question.
Mhm.
Hey, thanks for the demo. It's a great product. So how do you really understand that it's a different service? For instance, there could be a front end and a back end. So they talk regularly, and there could also be cases where there could be arbitrary interactions between services. But how do you make sure that they're like? I mean, are you trying to implement any algorithm that would plot a graph or something to represent dependencies among microservices?
Yeah, so there is a natural client and server, right? For example, in this case, the Shopsoft front end is behaving like a client, and it's making a server call to this one. So there is a natural order in the client service request in pretty much all the underlying communications. So that introduces the dependency. And what we are doing is this is actually based on the pod being the endpoint, right? So we identified this mapping criteria to be when we say group by, it's essentially how you define your nodes. So to your question, what is this graph about? So the node is the pod, and these arrow directions are telling you that, okay, in this particular communication, the front end is behaving like a client, and it's making a catalog call here, and these are all the URIs it's talking. Make sense?
Thanks, got it.
Yeah, so I had a quick question. So how are you actually like creating this sort of topology? Is it just like network relationships between pods? And if it is, like, how are you actually like tracking that and establishing those connections?
Yeah, so that's the key thing that I was mentioning here. So what we do is, if you guys have run like TCP dump or Wireshark, right? So all the packets are there. You can obtain them using the PCAP library, right? So we obtain the L3 packets. So A is talking to B. We get the packet, and from that packet we reconstruct what is it that A and B are talking, right? So that's the secret sauce here to do real time reconstruction of your communication between A and B, right? And one additional thing that we do in case of Kubernetes and Docker is that we also collect the metadata from the Kubernetes APIs and the Docker socket to marry to give the endpoint an identity, because on the packet you will only see an IP. So here we take that IP and we marry it with all the metadata associated with that IP, this pod, that namespace, and all that, and that becomes that gives you the who is talking to who, what is the identity of this person, and that's how we generate the topology map. Does that answer your?
Yeah, totally. Like one last question is that, like, can I like examine a relationship between two pods, or do I only know that they talk to each other? Like, can I investigate like how they're communicating and what type of network traffic it is?
Yeah, so like for example, I'm going to click on this link here, right? And where this says that the front end is the client, this is the catalog, and the catalog pod is the server. You can actually go pretty deep in there, and you can find out that these are the actual signatures of the communication that is going on. And you can even drill down further and figure out like, okay, what is the kind of request method that this guy is invoking? Looks like it's all get calls. And you can also, there are multiple ways to drill down. You can also look at server ports and things like that, right? So the complete information on both the ends is available. And we also have like CPU, RAM, memory matrix. So if you are seeing like that the latency goes up and then there is a memory also spiking on the server, you get both of them correlated at the same time as well. So yeah, you can dig deeper both on the system matrix as well as on the service interaction matrix.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think somebody in the comments asked, is this open source or is it just proprietary right now?
Pretty much everything is open source except for this one, which is essentially licensed out of the PhD work that was done at UPenn by our founders. So the deep packet analysis, the real-time stream processing of those packets, that is the only proprietary code, which is in the collector essentially. The rest, the time series database is Druid, the ingestion is Kafka, the visualization is React. So I guess the core thing is not open source then. This is a licensed technology out of UPenn, which was done by our founders.
Sounds good. Does anybody else have questions?
not, then you guys can try this pretty easily. We have a SaaS version, right? All you need to do is run kubectl and install the collectors as a daemon set, and you should be able to understand your dependencies and such. Yeah.
And we are also on the Google Cloud Launcher as of last week.
Yep.
Sounds good. Could you drop in a link for people who want to get started in the notes, please?
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
do that.
Awesome. And feel free to add anything on there that you want as well.
Good.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much for your demo. Okay, so Ben Perrys, are you around to talk about the app definition convention proposal?
Yes, I am.
Take it away.
Okay, I'm just going to drop a link to the proposal in the chat as well. So just to level set, this is not necessarily a specific proposal of this is what we should do, but this is us looking at what we see as a challenge and wondering if this community is interested in addressing it or feels that it's something that should be addressed, which is, despite the name of this group being SIG-Apps, there is no such thing as an application in Kubernetes today. And that introduces a lot of challenges, and people have tried to sort of solve it in different ways. We've certainly talked a lot about different config tools where people are effectively defining applications, but there's still no unifying concept of, well, what is the actual application that the developer is working with? And that makes it hard to write tooling that could then make it easier for the developer to work with their application in terms of exporting it, moving it around, just being able to see what components make up their application, being able to see what level of it that they're running at, and just generally manage it. And I know that Brian has started some sort of orthogonal discussions around declarative config management and how you would manage config levels of your resources. There's also a proposal for a manifest, which I think is intended to be an application manifest, and that might be an alternative embodiment to solve this problem. What this proposal, and again, it's sort of just a straw man proposal just to get the conversation started, but is, would we be interested in trying to define by convention a label that could apply to all resources associated with an application? And there would be nothing enforcing that this label existed, but at least for people who use this label, tools could be written that would recognize, okay, you have clearly labeled your resources in a way that this tooling is now able to treat all of these related resources as a common application. So that's sort of just a real minimal starting point. But again, I'm certainly looking to just start a discussion with the community of, do we want a first class or at least a second class concept of an application in Kubernetes? Again, with the goal of allowing us to then enhance UIs and tools that could leverage that definition to provide a better experience for developers. And so I tried to lay out just some real minimal use cases for it within the doc, and what we're trying to do, what we're not trying to do.
Very interesting. So is this part of the application definition working group that just was formed?
I don't believe that it has been discussed in that group, although I'm actually not a part of that group yet, so I'm not sure. Okay. I think that mostly that group has been discussing the declarative config management document and possibly the manifest proposal. If there's anybody on the call who's more familiar with the manifest proposal, I would definitely be interested in hearing how they feel that might fit with this, or is that a alternative to this that is more of a first class definition? I read through it and it wasn't entirely clear what the intent of the manifest was in terms of whether it could serve as an anchor for an application definition or not.
Okay, gotcha. Is anyone here that on this call from that working group?
I take it you're talking about the working group, the declarative application definition working group?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, so I have been, and Adnan has been as well. And so far we have not talked specifically about the definition of an app or how that relates. It's been more maybe a step lower of declarative configuration files and how do you interact with those? How does tooling work with those? That kinds of things. We haven't gone meta with kind of, do we separate an app? But that is something that could be brought up within the scope of that group, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like a good conversation for that as well. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this proposal? And does everyone have a link to the proposal?
It was dropped into chat for anybody
Okay.
who doesn't. It was a Google Doc. Okay.
Great. Yeah, Ben, this is really interesting and definitely something that I want to think more about. I think like it would be very helpful from like a tooling perspective. I just kind of like I'm wondering, or what kind of scenarios like are we thinking and what the kind of like standard format is. So love a chance to go through the proposal. Maybe we can start a chat on the mailing list about it and see if some other folks are interested, and then also follow up in the working group about this as well. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, and I did actually send it out to the mailing list maybe a week or two ago, and there's been some comments and discussion that has started to happen within the doc, at least a little bit. Definitely some questions about where this is going and some references to some of the other initiatives, like I said, the manifest proposal as well.
Cool. Awesome. Does anybody else have any comments about it? Or interest, like, does this seem helpful to you from a, perspective of deploying and managing applications in Kubernetes? Is this something that like feels like is the missing piece here to this group? So we got a +1 from Philip in the chat.
So I'm going to just jump in with one thing. If you have use cases for this, or if you have a perspective on it, please comment in that doc. I think one of the things that we sometimes forget here is that a lot of the folks in the Kubernetes community who work on other parts of Kubernetes and other teams, they are infrastructure operators and not always application developers or application operators. And because we day in and day out can sometimes do very different things, they don't always see the use cases, understand the scenarios, or even operate in the same way. Because if you look at how a company like Google operates their applications and does things, it might be radically different from the way another company does. In fact, it often is. And so if we have those perspectives or those thoughts, please take a minute and jump in and share, just so that other people who don't have some of the context and needs don't assume they get it. Sometimes it's worth spelling it out or sharing those things so they can have a better perspective. And so if you could take a minute, it would be useful. That's all.
And looks like there was a question in the chat about why not base it off of namespaces, and that was actually raised in the discussion in the doc as well. That is the mode that it looks like Box, I guess they do that. They have a namespace per application. Not everybody wants to do that because you do end up with an explosion of namespaces, and so you may well want to have an individual developer has a namespace and you don't want to give them unlimited namespaces, but they want to deploy multiple applications. So that was why we felt that we needed something more constrained than just saying you have an app per namespace.
Is there like this concept in OpenShift?
There is not. They're very loosely in that we do some of the tooling that OpenShift has, like the OC new app command, automatically applies a app equals some name label to all the resources it creates. So similar to what's being proposed here, although not quite as formalized. I don't believe the UI actually does much based off of that. So just a real light flavor of it in OpenShift.
Yeah, we ended up doing something like that for draft as well, so that we could figure out what pods we wanted to talk to specifically. So we ended up adding a label as well. So it seems like it's useful for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, the label again is sort of probably the least controversial light touch approach. Certainly, a first-class resource provides some advantages around things like deletion, where you could have owner references to an anchoring object. So I think it's definitely worth discussing, is it worth having a first class thing here? And that's again where I'm interested in the manifest proposal and whether that could also serve as the anchoring object or if that has a different intended purpose.
And there's lots of neat things you could do with this, right? So from an auditing standpoint, you could say, oh, I have a namespace. Look at, here's all the things that are part of the app. Look at all these other things that are running in the namespace that aren't associated with an app. So there's lots of varying ways some of these concepts may have applicability.
Yeah, and even just looking at what's the resource consumption, how many persistent volumes is this app using, or what's the total memory request that this application has, by being able to look at all of the replica sets that are associated with that application. Just gives you a lot of different ways that you can better understand your resources at the level that people typically tend to think of them as an application.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have some comments in the chat. If you want to address any of those, feel free.
Yeah, so not sure I understand why this is anything different than a set of standard labels. Yeah, so again, two things. I mean, what is in the proposal? That is absolutely all it is, do we want to have a convention of a label? Again, the proposal is sort of a dual purpose. One is to lay out a straw man, which is that. The other is really to just start this discussion of, does Kubernetes need an application concept? And if it does, is the app label the right thing, or maybe something more first class is the right thing? But yeah, as what's laid out here was sort of just the lightest touch of, is this something that would have value? And maybe not. There's certainly a fair concern to be raised here of, if it's only by convention, then there's no guarantee it's there. How much tooling do you want to really build around something that may not actually always be universally applicable? But yeah, that really is all that's here. It's not a deep, heavy proposal, but I want to see where the conversation goes from there.
How would like someone use this concept, like from an end user perspective? Like, do you see them using kubectl, like get apps or something, and then pass in a name, just like we do for other resource types? Or, how do you see the end user interacting with this, other than building tooling on top of it using the labels and SDK and all that?
Saying get apps is definitely, if it is implemented as a label, probably a little bit fuzzy because it's not really a resource. I would expect maybe that there would be a different set, possibly a different set of tooling. Like you could have a kubectl app subcommand that operates on application concepts, assuming that they aren't first class. Now, again, if we ended up doing it as a first class resource, then OC get apps would certainly make sense. But if it's just by label, I think I would expect it to be a separate set of subcommands that would operate on that.
Gotcha. Cool. Anybody else have questions or comments? Do you have any other comments you want to address, Ben, from the chat?
Not seeing anything. If someone feels I haven't addressed their comment, definitely unmute yourself and speak up, I guess. But in skimming through this, I'm not seeing direct questions. So.
This is Ryan J. I was someone mentioned a working group around this proposal. Is there a working group? Is there another place other than the doc to keep in touch on this topic?
The working group is on declarative management, not specifically on this topic. Once that working group gets started, the discussions that happen there, or whatever comes out of it, we'll be reporting on it.
I just pasted a link to the that specific working group's discussion on the from the Kubernetes SIG-Apps mailing list. So if anybody's interested in that conversation about the working group, it's there. The link is in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks. Ben, this might be an interesting thing to bring up in the working group as well, because they probably have thoughts around this as well.
Yeah, I think so. I may try and bring it over there. I like someone said that I know they're more focused on sort of the lower level, just individual resource, applying changes to those resources. But certainly, I think that ultimately the goal is this is tangentially related to what's going on there.
Yeah. Okay, so if anybody else has comments or thoughts, please share your opinion, like Matt Farina had mentioned, on that proposal in the form of a comment. Ben, do you have anything else you want to share with us?
Nope, I think that's it. I appreciate everybody who's commented already so far and look forward to hearing other thoughts that people have. And I'll just reiterate one more time, this is a launching point for a discussion. So if you like the idea of it having applications, but you hate the idea of it being a label, that's perfectly fine. And I look forward to hearing what your thoughts are instead.
Thank you. All right, folks. So does anybody else have anything they want to discuss? We have some time. All right. So this will be
I thought that somebody from SIG cluster lifecycle wanted to discuss the update strategy that's being proposed for daemon set.
Yep. Hi, this is Diego from CoreOS, and yes, I sent out a link last week and kind of introduced the problem, and didn't get a lot of feedback. So I was wondering if anyone looked at it and just didn't have any comments, or if people didn't have a chance to take a look.
Do you want to give us a rundown for those of us who didn't see that?
Sure. So let's see. So for 1.8, we were trying to get a feature in, which is a new update strategy for daemon sets. So basically, currently, daemon sets only allow you to have one rolling update strategy, which is kill pods before creating new pods, kind of keeping the invariant that you have no more than one pod running on each node for the given daemon set. And what we wanted to add was a kind of surge parameter similar to deployments, where you can actually create a new pod first before reclaiming the old pod. And we were doing this in a API compatible way, so we had to create a new strategy rather than just add parameters to the old strategy. But one difficulty we ran into, or one kind of question that was raised in particular by a few people on SIG-Apps, was how this would work with host ports, because daemon sets obviously are running on every node, or every node matching some sort of selector, right? So, and they're often used in conjunction with host ports. And the problem is, if you try to run two pods at the same time that are trying to use the same host port, obviously that's going to conflict. And currently, the daemon set controller doesn't allow this. It just won't schedule the new pod. And so we were discussing whether we would be able to relax that restriction and allow for those two pods to coexist. And that would require a bit of support from the networking stack, which based on our research, it may support in some cases and might not. Or the other option would just be to punt on this and just fail validation and say, if you're trying to use host ports, sorry, this strategy is incompatible and we will not validate that daemon set definition. So we just wanted to, this has kind of been lingering in the design discussion. I can try to dig up the PR links, but basically we wanted to break out this one problem and try to hammer it through. So I shared a doc last week, and I'll paste the link back into the chat. But as I said, I was wondering if anyone actually had a chance to look at it. I also mailed it out to the mailing list middle of last week. So, yeah.
I've been participating in the entire thing with introducing the update strategy. And I think we still have a couple of concerns. One is the time horizon, because we're trying to take daemon set, we actually merged daemon set to V1 last week. So we're trying to release a GA version of it. And there's a lot of concern around introducing a relatively complicated update strategy without alpha feature gating and evolution at the same time that we release a GA version of the API. So there's a huge risk around that, and a lot of people are kind of concerned about stability as we try to GA this feature. in a more general concern, there's kind of a concern about why are we doing this at all, in terms of based on the use case of self-hosting. You can do it with static pods. It's being done today with static pods. Why do we want to introduce this potentially complicated update strategy if it doesn't serve any other use cases than just self-hosting, which is already being done today? Like, if it makes self-hosting easier, but generally introducing an entire upgrade strategy, a new upgrade strategy, which we have to evolve through various levels of stability and then maintain for the lifetime of the API service, should be motivated by more than a single use case.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a fair point. We've been trying to find other use cases. I mean, I think it's possible to imagine situations in which people might want to start a new pod before the old pod is reclaimed, just for, minimizing downtime of whatever service they're running. And just because we didn't offer that so far doesn't mean that there's no use for it. As to why it's you said it's a large risk and a big new strategy. It's, I implemented it and it's pretty small. I think it also mirrors the same functionality in daemon set. So it's not, I don't think it's a kind of crazy wild new idea. I agree that it's solving it's arising for some specific use cases in the self-hosting world where we need this strategy. But I also don't think it's, kind of a little one-off feature that has niche uses.
So the only thing we're seeing is the feedback from the majority of people who are implementing add-ons, and the reason the host port is such a concern is that it's not the way that most of the people are using daemon sets to implement add-ons, and it actually, because of the host port conflicts with the way that most people are using it. So it's more along the lines of there's no evidence that, other than self-hosting, people need this feature in order to utilize daemon set, or it makes their lives easier. And there is evidence that for the majority of add-ons that are currently implemented, that it probably won't work because they're using host networking. It might be a little bit dangerous in the cases where you're doing something like a distributed file system and you have multiple nodes or multiple pods that would potentially be writing to the same path on the host file system. The other thing is...
Sorry, can I pause you there
Sure.
before moving on to more concerns? Firstly, can you possibly link to some of these concerns that you said that people have in the in the add-ons space? Like, I haven't seen anything, so if you can add to the doc or to the design doc, that would be really helpful to kind of move this forward. And also, you mentioned host network.
The concerns were brought up in the proposal in terms of the host port, in terms of being able to deal with.
We're trying to address them, but you haven't. I haven't heard anything about add-ons specifically until right now.
So one thing before we go a little bit further on this, so there's nothing that requires a host port to be defined on a pod definition. Services don't actually care. So there's no reason that you should be able to omit completely on the pod the host port definition, and on the service specify which port you want to talk to on the pod, and you still use host networking. Now, you won't get scheduler isolation, but you don't actually want scheduler isolation, and you will not get someone else who comes along and tries to take that port. But since the use case here is that you're trying to reuse a port that someone else is already using, that's probably an acceptable trade-off. Have you guys explored that yet?
I don't follow exactly.
You don't have to
so basically, the things you describe in the manifest of the pod, things like scarce resources like host ports, the scheduler will look at what is already on each node and avoid scheduling you if something else is using that scarce resource. But if you're using host networking, your pod can bind any host port it wants, even if it doesn't declare it in the pod. And so basically what the workarounds have talked about is, I want two pods to run that both say they use the same host port, and I'm going to do app level things to ensure that they actually can both bind and do the handoff.
Right.
But at the point where you're requiring app level things to participate in shared scarce resources, the scheduler can't help you anymore.
Right.
So
Yeah, I've covered all of this in the doc. And you know, this is specific about host port. So host networking, yes, those pods will schedule. And you know, if you want, you know, on the application side, you can handle using reuse sock, you know, to open the port, and you can do that. And I think this concerns are specifically around using host port resources, which right now in the daemon set controller are hard coded to prevent, you know, double scheduling. And you know,
so one of the main problems with like a rolling update strategy for a daemon set is that we don't have an intermediate object representation. So for a deployment rolls out to a replica set, and that rolls out to pods, right? And so in a rolling deployment, it can create a second replica set, keep the first one in place, and wait until the second one has its pods up before it starts to scale down the replica set. But with a daemon set, you're going directly to pods, and so you don't have a good intermediate object that can stay in your safe state, waiting for the new scale up to succeed and then scale down. And so I think that's a pretty fundamental difference between daemon set and deployment, that intermediate object that can manage your roll up.
The other big thing is, now that we're talking about schedulers, we're from a scheduler side, the scheduler predicates that we have inside of daemon set have been somewhat painful to maintain. And it's not clear that we're going this direction, but there's definitely proposals out there to move the daemon set to use the default scheduler and push it through. And I'm not sure if we do this and if you implement complicated logic for handling this upgrade strategy inside of daemon set, and then we decide to go through the scheduler, the default scheduler itself later on, if that ties us in there and we can't do it. And the other one is there's been requests for at most one daemon set per node. And the proposed implementation would be to use something in the node name in order to create a unique name for the pod so that you can never create more than one pod per node. That's the exact opposite of the semantics that we're asking to implement for this rolling update strategy, and I don't think that will be possible. So, I mean, I'd like to see those two issues completely addressed and closed out before we do something that, and not to say that we should do either of those things. Maybe we should not do either of those things, but I'd like to see the conversation resolved and a decision made before we go and do something that locks us out from doing them forever and for the lifetime of the API.
Okay. Well, I would like to, you know, I guess why I'm here is I'm looking for guidance on, well, how do we move those conversations forward? I've been, you know.
So I've actually been trying to talk to SIG scheduling about this, but that would be one place to start. Just we can look at the issues and try to get resolution on whether we want to do that, and look at and try to get input from SIG scheduling and all the people who open those issues that have been kind of maintained for a while now, and just close them. And then if we decide to do this, I'd still like to do it after V1 as opposed to doing it concurrently with the V1 release.
Okay.
But if we can solve all the issues in 1.9, there's nothing to stop us from doing it in the subsequent release.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Is the next conversation we need to have with SIG scheduling? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, and some members of SIG-Apps, I would definitely say should be there. I could try to set something up with the relevant people for sometime this week or next week.
That sounds great.
That'd be great.
I'll note this in our notes. Just 1 second. All right, sounds good. Does anybody have any other thoughts they'd like to share on this? Okay. Anybody else want to talk about anything? Okay, I will take silence as no. Thanks for joining this week. See you next week.